Good evening. Good evening. My name is Chris Arnold, and on behalf of the Bob and Aleicia Woodrick Diversity Learning Center in Grand Rapids Community College, we're pleased to have you here tonight for our 17th season celebrating new voices through our diversity lecture series. And it is a real honor to have Mr. Bahari with us here tonight. I'd like to just acknowledge a few individuals that are with us here tonight. Dr. Richard Reiskamp and Mr. Richard Verberg, our board chair. And our trustees, our board of trustees work really hard for our college and our community. And we thank them for all the work that they do in their support of the diversity initiatives here at GRCC. And I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors. This series would not be possible without the support of our generous sponsors. Our diversity champions include the Nokomis Foundation in Steelcase. I'd also like to acknowledge Mr. Brian Cloyd for his continuing support, and you'll get a chance to meet Ms. Deb Bailey in a few minutes. So thank you, Brian and Steelcase, for all your support. Our diversity advocates include Aquinas College, the Center for the Education of Women at the University of Michigan, Varnum Law, and Warner Norcross and Judd. Our diversity partners are Amway, Davenport University, Fountain Street Church, Michigan Radio, and SMG Management, DeVos Place. And we never forget how important it is to have our local organizations supporting us. And also, too, you can take a look in your program, and there's additional supporters and friends listed in your program. So again, we're very grateful for the support that we get to be able to offer this series to you. And for those of you that are interested in making a contribution, you can certainly do that out at the information table as well. And I'd like to just take a moment to thank our diversity team for their continuing commitment, and a special thank you to the Diversity Learning Center staff, which is Jennifer Smith, Tamber Bustance, Kathleen Owens, and our student worker, London Johnson. And then all the volunteers that are here tonight, and our GRCC media team, Class Quant, thank you. And then really a special thank you to Fountain Street Church. This is such an amazing venue and such a wonderful partner to have. So thank you to Fountain Street Church, Heather, Melissa, Gary, and David for hosting us here tonight. For those of you who parked in one of the GRCC ramps, you can pick up a parking pass, which will give you a discount to get out of the ramp tonight. And then you also have an evaluation in your program. If you could please take a moment to fill that out. Your feedback is really important to us as we try to continuously improve our programming here. Or if you have a suggestion for a speaker that you would like to hear, that would be great. This is our 17th year, and we're really proud of our history of offering diverse voices to help engage our community in global and local viewpoints. Mr. Bahari has a powerful story to share with us tonight, a story that is both personal and political. His story highlights the activism of multiple generations in his family, all seeking a more just and liberated Iran, a country that they all love and wish a more peaceful and prosperous future. I imagine that you all experience his sense of humor as well. And now I am pleased to introduce someone who I truly admire, and someone who, and all of you who know Miss Deb Bailey cannot help but be drawn to her directness and her integrity. She is a good friend to GRCC and a champion of inclusion and intercultural understanding. Please welcome Miss Deb Bailey, Director of Corporate Community Relations at Steelcase, who are introduce our speaker this evening.
Thank you. Maziar Bahari is an Iranian-Canadian journalist, filmmaker, and human rights activist. He was born in Tehran, Iran, but moved to Canada in 1988 to study film and political science. Upon completion of his degree, he made his first film, The Voyage of the St. Louis, which was about the attempt of 937 German Jewish refugees to escape Nazi Germany on that ship in 1939. Only to be turned away by both Cuba and the United States and ultimately forced to return to the Third Reich. This made him the first Muslim to make a film about the Holocaust. He has produced a number of other documentaries and news reports for Channel 4, the BBC, and other broadcasters around the world. In 2003, the Harvard Film Archives praised his work at providing a look at important social issues in his country. He's won several awards and nominations, including an Emmy in 2005. In 2009, Bahari was nominated by Desmond Tutu for the Prince of Asturias Award for Concord, widely known as Spain's Nobel Prize. In 1997, he began reporting in Iran and making independent documentaries, and in 1989, he became Newsweek magazine's Iran correspondent. On June 21, 2009, he was arrested at his family's home in Tehran and incarcerated. An international campaign to free him was started and included many professional organizations, family, friends, as well as the U.S. Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, speaking publicly on his case. After 118 days in jail, he was released on a $300,000 bail and charged with 11 counts of espionage. He was allowed to leave the country, return to London to join his wife, Paolo Gurley, just days before the birth of his daughter. Following his release, he launched a campaign in support of other incarcerated journalists in Iran. He also wrote a best-selling family memoir, Then They Came For Me. The Toronto Star said a gripping story that weaves his family's history of incarceration by Iran rulers with his own. Mother Jones said it's a fascinating human exploration into Bahari's personal experience, but it also provides insights into the shared experience of those affected by repressive governments everywhere. Jon Stewart of The Daily Show, who is working with Bahari on a film based on the book, called it incredible. In viewing the link on Bahari on The Daily Show, and of course when I Googled it, that was the first thing that popped up, I was struck within the midst of the insanity, the evil, and the fear, he used his strength and his sense of humor as the most effective tool he had to survive. Please welcome Maziar Bahari.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. First of all, I have to apologize to everyone because I'm a bit ill, so I don't sound as good as I usually do. Usually I sound baritone, but today it's a bit of a, thank you, mezzo-soprano or something like that. So, and also it's an honor to be here where Eleanor Roosevelt, Malcolm X, Susan Steinem, and Frank Zappa, they were here. So it's a real honor to be here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the importance of US-Iran relations, not only now, but I'm going to go back to the early 20th century, when the United States had a different image in Iran. And to start with, I would like to ask everyone here if they know any of these three names I'm going to mention. There's a fourth name that most of you will know, but let's start with these three names. Morgan Schuster. Does anyone know Morgan Schuster? Howard Baskerville. Samuel Jordan. Well, if I ask about these three names in any Iranian school, they wouldn't know that either. And I think we have a problem right there, because these three people, they are three great Americans who went to Iran in early 20th century, and they're also Iranian heroes. In 1906, Iranians staged the revolution. They called it the Constitutional Revolution. It was for the first time in the Middle East and even actually in Asia that a nation rose against the tyrant and asked the tyrant to act according to the Constitution. In 1907, they asked an American lawyer called Morgan Schuster, who used to be based in the Philippines, to go to Iran to take care of the treasury. And what Schuster witnessed in Iran was a widening gap between different levels of Iranian society. But and he wrote a very good book later on called Strangling of Persia, which is about strangling of the Iranian people, Persian people at the time, by two empires, by the Russian Empire and the British Empire. But what really struck Schuster, if you read his book, what really struck Schuster was this widening gap between the elite of the society, and I'm not talking about the elite of the society in a sense that the people in power. I'm talking about the intellectuals, the people who are cultivated in the society, and the masses of in the society. And he thought that, as long as this gap between the elite of the society and the masses, the uneducated poor masses, widens, there cannot be a real solution to Iran's maladies. So Schuster started a fight which he knew he would lose eventually in 1907 when he was invited by the Iranian parliament to go there. And first of all, he had to fight against the king, who was basically, his affairs were run by the British, who monopolized the southern territory of Iran and the Russian Empire in the north. And Schuster eventually was kicked out of Iran in 1911. Another American, Howard Baskerville, went to Iran and fought against the Iranian tyrant with the Iranian revolutionaries in 1909. Baskerville was a Presbyterian missionary who chose to go to Iran as an adventurer, but when he arrived in Iran, he witnessed, again like Schuster, he witnessed this widening gap between the elite of the society and the masses. And he tried to narrow that gap through culture. So he staged certain plays, and then he started to join the revolutionaries. And after about 6 months in Iran, he lost his life. And he's known in Iran as the American martyr, Howard Baskerville. And Samuel Jordan was another Presbyterian missionary who went to Iran in 1920, 11 years after Baskerville. And what Jordan decided to do was to create the first modern high school in Iran, which is called Alborz High School. And Jordan started a movement that it's not I don't think it's far-fetched to say that it's a movement that resulted in the Iranian Revolution in 1979, 59 years later. So you can see the roots of what is happening in Iran in the ideals that somehow imported by Americans in the early 20th century. And it's very ironic that in 1979, the Iranians rose against a tyrant, the Shah, who was backed by the Americans. But there was a journey after Baskerville, Schuster, and Jordan went to Iran. The fourth person that most of you will know is Harry Truman, who is also regarded as a hero in Iran, because in 1945, after the end of the Second World War, the Soviet troops, the Allied forces, of course, they occupied Iran in 1941 as a way to stop Hitler's advance in the Eastern Front. And after the Second World War in 1945, the British and the American forces withdrew from Iran, but the Russians, they maintained their forces in the northern province of Azerbaijan in Iran. And eventually they created this socialist Republic of Azerbaijan in Iran. And it was only with the help of Harry Truman, an American government, that Iranians managed to gain back the province of Azerbaijan to have the integrity of territory. And they asked Truman, how did you do it? And he said that I called Stalin and I asked him to withdraw his forces, or else. And they asked him, so what was Stalin's answer? He said he withdrew his forces. So in that era, up to, let's say, 1951, 52, Americans, they had a very, very positive image in Iran. They were regarded as the benevolent empire, especially compared to the Russian Empire and the British Empire, who were looting Iran for decades at the time, especially the British, who monopolized the Iranian oil in southern Iran, and they basically treated the southern territories of Iran as part of the British Empire. So when the nationalization movement started in Iran in 1951 by a prime minister, by the Iranian prime minister Mohammad Mossadegh, Mossadegh also believed in American benevolence. And Truman actually truly believed in Mossadegh's fight against the British, because Truman, like most Americans, hated the colonial approach of the British. But for different reasons, in 1953, something happened that changed the image of Americans, and also it changed their dynamics in the relationship between Iran and America, Iran and America. And that was a coup d'etat that was supported by the CIA, that was basically designed by the CIA and carried out by the CIA. And the reason for that decision was to stop the advancement of Soviet Union. And many of you are too young to remember the Cold War event, but in the early 1950s, the Cold War was a reality. The Soviet Union was taking over different countries, especially in the developing world, one by one, and that was the main fear of the American government at the time. And when you go back to the literature of the time, there's nothing, no one talks about anything except for the Cold War, and it was the era of McCarthyism. So the American government, the central government, the federal government was really under pressure to take action against the Soviets. So they backed this coup d'etat, they designed it, and they brought back the Shah of Iran, who started his reign from 1941, and then he was a weak Shah. He was the weak king from 1941 to 1952, and then he escaped to Rome. And the Americans, they brought him to power, and they supported him wholeheartedly. And that was, I think that was really a milestone in Iran-America relationship, because from 1953 on, America was not that benevolent empire anymore. America was seen in Iran as the master of the Shah. America was seen as the country that is against the independence of Iran. America was seen as another empire like the British and the Soviet Empire. And worst of all, when you go back to the literature, when you go back to even the CIA diaries of the time, you can see that many CIA officers in Iran who brought Shah back to power, they did not agree with what he was doing. They did not agree with human rights abuses, but they failed in communicating with Iranian people. And there lies a problem that we will get back to it later on. But I would like to show you a clip from a film that I made for the BBC a few years ago about the Iranian Revolution and the origins of the Iranian Revolution. This scene talks about the period after the coup, after the 1953 coup. And I interviewed a member of the Communist Party of Iran, a party that actually my father belonged to, and my father actually went through very similar experiences that this man talks about in this clip. So if you can play that first clip, please.
He had already created his own intelligence agency. After the 1953 coup, the CIA helped him set up SAVAK, the Organization for National Intelligence and Security. To the Shah, the communists and supporters of Mossadegh were his only serious opposition. SAVAK ruthlessly suppressed them through torture and execution. Muhammad Ali Amoui was a member of Iran's Communist Party's military underground network. He was imprisoned after the 1953 coup and spent 24 years in prison.
اصلا نمیتونم توضیح بدم که نوع دردش چیه. من فقط اشاره میکنم این فوتبالیستا وقتی که توپ به بیضه‌شون میخوره چه حالتی پیدا میکنن. اصلا قابل مقایسه نیست با اون دردی که یک سفره چرمی هست، بیضه رو میذارن و یواش یواش شروع میکنن به ماساژ دادن. نمیتونه تداوم پیدا کنه، بیهوش میشه آدم.
So this is the experience of many Iranian activists. It's not only the communists who suffered this kind of treatment in the hands of the Shah's men, but also many other religious activists, nationalists, and others. And the Shah, as a result of the wholehearted American support, became so, let's say, megalomaniac that he thought he could do anything. And he basically closed every space for expression to people. And he denied all different groups to express themselves. And this treatment of his own people, it was somehow tolerated by the American government, even though the Americans, it's very interesting if you go back to the diaries of American diplomats in Iran, and when you listen to some of the diplomats who were there in Iran, and at the time they were really, really against the Shah's regime. But the Americans, they were somehow, we can say that they were blinded by two things. One was the fear of the Soviet Union, and another one was the fact that Iran was, and they needed the Shah in order to stop the Soviet aggression, but also they were enjoying their relationship, their commercial relationship with the Shah's regime. The Shah was selling oil at a relatively cheap price and was buying American goods and American, especially military equipment. And the Americans, unfortunately, they lost sight of the bigger picture of the animosity that they're creating in the country, in Iran, that would haunt them for years to come. So we can watch maybe two clips of the same film that in which I talked to to an American diplomat, and also we talk about the Shah's military ambitions and the fact that he wanted to become the first non-nuclear military power in the world.
As the money rolled in, the Shah continued to pursue his lifelong ambition of turning Iran into a military superpower. This suited the United States. President Nixon had already adopted his Nixon doctrine of allowing other nations to assume greater responsibilities for their own defense. The security of the Persian Gulf was readily delegated to the Shah.
What is your ambition? To be the fourth largest military power in the world?
Probably the best, non-atomic.
Today, Iran's armed forces possess simply the best military equipment in the world, no matter where it's made. This combined artillery battalion is made up both of 175mm guns from America and 130s from Russia, the ones the North Vietnamese used to such effect. It's a powerful combination.
From where the Shah sat, Iran's impressive economic growth and political stability offered lessons for other countries.
You will have to change, because if you don't change, I don't know what is going to happen to you in the future.
What do you think will happen?
Go back to the caves?
You think that's our fate?
If it continues really in this way, it might take some time, but you are going to go down and down. You can't move up.
Because of our lack of discipline, you think?
Because of your lack of discipline. This is the best word that could be used.
While the Shah focused on his foreign enemies, SAVAK, his intelligence agency, was losing sight of the real threat closer to home. The oil wealth had mainly benefited a small group close to the Shah. The gap between rich and poor was becoming a gulf. In Najaf, Ayatollah Khomeini sharpened his pen.
The Shah has been talking about progress for more than 10 years, but the majority of people are engulfed in poverty and misery. He has beautified Tehran on the surface and has built multi-story buildings for himself and his cronies. But in villages where the majority of people live, they don't even have the most basic standard of living.
Foreign intelligence organizations were seemingly oblivious to the grievances building up within Iran. The CIA was much more interested in what was going on in its northern neighbor, the Soviet Union.
The reading from Washington was that the Shah was completely in control, that there was no great threat to his rule, and we didn't have to pay much attention to that. And I realize for Iranians, this is impossible to believe. I mean, that the Americans were not worried about all of the little things that were going on inside Iran. For the most part, we really were not interested at all. Iran was a base from which we could watch a lot of other things going on, but it was not, we were not particularly interested in the domestic operations in Iran itself.
The world...
The Ayatollah Khomeini, who was based in Iraq at the time, led a revolution in 1979 that brought Shah down, and then a year later, a group of student activists took over the American embassy in Iran, took 52 innocent Americans hostage for 444 days. And that was the end of any kind of diplomatic relationship between Iran and the United States. But at the same time, something happened under the Islamic regime, which was, in a strange way, the continuation of the ideals that those three Americans I mentioned at the beginning of my talk somehow started in Iran, and somehow narrowed the gap between the elite of the society. Again, I'm not talking about the people in power, I'm talking about the educated, cultivated elite and the masses. And those let's say four phenomena was, first of all, women in Iran before the revolution, because many women in the religious traditional sectors, they did not believe in the educational system because it was, they called it a westernized education system. Many families from traditional families, they did not send their daughters, their sisters to schools. So many women, they did not take part in social activities. After the revolution, because everything was Islamicized, many women, they took part in social activities, and they became part part of the elite as well, and that somehow contributed to narrowing the gap. The other one was the clerics, that the clerics, they became more politicized after the Iranian Revolution. And before the revolution, the clerics were just, as in most countries, they were taking care of people's religious affairs. But after the revolution, the clerics, they became technocrats, they became ministers, they became intelligence interrogators even. And they became also part of the political movement, even part of the political movement against the Islamic regime. And that somehow contributed to narrow the gap. And the education in general, whatever we can say about the brutality of this government, the fact is that this government has created a number of universities around the country. And in those universities, many people who did not have any opportunity to go to school before the revolution, they had the chance to have that. Of course, the government wanted to indoctrinate people into believing that the Islamic system will be a role model for other Islamic countries and also for other countries in the world. But by the very fact that people went to school, people had higher education, and people learned about what was going on in the world, it somehow enlightened people. But there was still something missing in the up to, let's say, late 1990s, that people only were receiving the information from the Iranian government and the Iranian propaganda. But in the late 1990s, with the digital revolution, with the advent of satellite television and the internet, and people having access to information from the outside world, that took the Iranian, a generation of Iranians to another level, and that really somehow sped up the movement for more democracy, for more reforms in Iran. And in 2009, what happened was the continuation of, let's say, those three Americans, they started in the early 20th century, but also it was really the crystallization of the movement that really reached a new point in the late 1990s. People in 2009, when there was the election, when I went back I was based in London at the time, and I went back to Iran to make a BBC documentary about the election, and then I was covering the election for Newsweek magazine and Channel 4 in the UK as well. And what I witnessed in 2009, before the presidential election, when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad ran for re-election, was that there was this battle that had its origin in the Iranian constitutional revolution. This was this battle between the people who were enlightened, informed, and educated against another group who were not educated, not maybe well educated, who were somehow ignorant about what was going on in the rest of the world. And those people, of course, let's say the ignorant, they voted for Ahmadinejad, and we cannot say that they were religious. It was religious against the seculars or the rich against the poor. I think it was a clear battle between the people who knew about the rest of the world, and they had the information about the rest of the world and were willing to receive the information from the rest of the world, against people who were living in very claustrophobic, very contained religious environments. And of course, in Iran, those people who live in very religious environments and in very claustrophobic environments, they're manipulated by the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, who chose Ahmadinejad as his preferred candidate, and also he's the person who runs the Revolutionary Guards. So on June 12th, 2009, people thought that their candidate, many pro-reform people, they thought that their candidate, Mousavi, was going to win. And from all the indications that we journalists had, and also some surveys, the secret surveys that were done by different secret agencies that were leaked to the press, we thought that Mousavi was going to win. But on the night of the June 12th, we heard something else, that Ahmadinejad had won the elections with landslide. Ahmadinejad had 25 million votes and Mousavi had only 16 million votes. And that was really surprising to people. It was not only surprising, but it was humiliating. So for 2 days, people didn't know what to do. There were some demonstrations here and there, but on the 15th of June, millions of people went to the streets. And I was in the same streets in Tehran as a kid during the Iranian Revolution and witnessed the Iranian Revolution against the Shah. And almost 30 years later, I saw the same amount of people rising against the re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And of course, as a reporter, I just had to report this. And from all the evidence that I had and all the other people had, what happened in Iran tantamount to a military coup. And I reflected that in my reports. So the demonstrations went on for 4 days, actually, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And on Friday, the supreme leader of Iran, whom I think, unfortunately, most Americans don't know, most people in the world don't know his name, is Ayatollah Khamenei, because people in Iran, they think, people outside of Iran, they think that the dictator of Iran is Ahmadinejad. Whereas Ahmadinejad is really like a prime minister in an absolute kingdom. The king is Ayatollah Khamenei, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. I can write his name for you later. And Ahmadinejad is just maybe a servant to this king. So Ayatollah Khamenei on June the 19th told pro-reform people who came to the streets against Ahmadinejad's re-election to go back home or else. And he said that they would be the people who would have to pay for the bloodshed. And of course, by mentioning the word bloodshed, he was threatening people. And on June 20th, of course, there was bloodshed in the streets of Tehran. I saw some of the worst images that I've ever seen in my life. On June the 20th, I saw young people, young women, they were beaten with truncheons, with guns, and with everything that the Revolutionary Guards had, only because they were just expressing themselves. And then I was really, really tired that night. I went home. I went to sleep. Before I went to sleep, of course, I saw the footage of this woman, Neda, who was killed with a bullet in the streets of Tehran. And that was really the last straw. And I was exhausted, and I thought that I had to go to sleep. And then the next morning, I was staying with my mother, of course, in Iran, and I was woken up by my mother at 8 o'clock in the morning, and my mother said that there are 4 gentlemen here who want to take you away. Those 4 gentlemen, of course, did not say who they were. They did not had an arrest, but they had an arrest warrant, but they did not show me who issued the arrest warrant or where they were going to take me. They just took me away. They blindfolded me. They put handcuffs on me. And from the direction where we were going, I knew that we were going to Evin prison in Iran, in Tehran, in North Tehran. And when they took my blindfold off and they took me to the interrogation room, I asked my interrogator, who was the person who actually came to arrest me. And the first thing he told me that you never look at me, you always look down. When you're here, you never look into my eyes, because they know that if you look at their eyes, you can have the upper hand. And I asked him, so what are my charges? Why am I here? He said, you are charged with espionage, and we know that you've been spying for 4 different agencies. And I asked him, do you mind if you tell me 4 different agencies? I mean, it's almost impossible for someone to work for, I've heard about double agents, but triple agent, quadruple agent, it's a bit difficult to understand. So he said, yes, you've been spying for American CIA, Israeli Mossad, British MI6, and Newsweek. And I asked him, so do you mean by Newsweek, you mean Newsweek magazine? He said, your quote-unquote magazine is part of the American intelligence apparatus. And we know that and it's common knowledge that all the magazine editors, they are assigned by the CIA. I said, oh, I didn't know that, okay. So there and then I knew that there was a scenario for me, and I was part of this plot, and I had to play a role in this plot. I didn't know what the plot was, but the charges, they went from ridiculous to more ridiculous, and some of you may have seen the interviews, but we always have to go back to the Daily Show evidence against me. And let's play this clip. I think about 2 weeks before the elections, the Daily Show had a series of specials on Iran, and they sent Jason Jones, one of their correspondents, to Iran to cover the elections. And Jason talked to different people, but on the first day when they came to Iran, I had a conversation with me. I was editing my BBC program, so I met them in the lobby of the hotel, and I gave them some names. And I told them, okay, you can talk to this person, he's good from this point of view, the other person. So I gave them some names without knowing that we were being really monitored. And then, as the evidence, they showed me this footage. Do a part of the book that deals with the interrogation, the Daily Show interrogation, which was really the evidence that was used against me. And of course, when you're charged with something that you haven't done, whatever evidence they bring forward is ridiculous. But they went one step further. So I saw the flicker of a laptop screen through my blindfold. Then I heard someone speaking. It was a recording of another prisoner's confession. It's not that one, said the new interrogator. It's the one marked spy in coffee shop. Before the elections, Tehran had a vibrant cafe society. Young men and women got together, their green band fastened around their wrists, talking about the campaign and what they planned to do after Mousavi was elected president. I spent a lot of time in different coffee shops in Tehran conducting interviews in order to get a sense of what young people were thinking. Perhaps they had filmed me at the time speaking to friends. This worried me. I was coming to understand just how ruthless these people were, how willing they were to believe their own lies, to construct their own version of the truth. I worried about who else might be imprisoned somewhere in this building, behind these impenetrable walls, because of my reporting. I was immersed in these thoughts when I heard the voice of Jon Stewart from Comedy Central's The Daily Show, and then that of Jason Joyce, a Daily Show correspondent. What is that? What is that makes these people evil, Jones was saying. I hadn't signed up for Twitter, so the only way to find out was going and see it for myself. No, I thought. They can't be that stupid. Among the hundreds of journalists from news organizations around the world who had come to Iran to report on the elections was a team from Jon Stewart's satirical news show. I had met Jason, his producer Tim Greenberg, and their translator Mahmoud about 3 weeks before the election. Over a few cups of Turkish coffee, we discussed the situation in Iran, and Jason asked if he could interview me on camera in a coffee shop. Jason was going to pretend to be a thick-skulled American, and their goal was to present an image of Iran different from the one typically shown on American television. I agreed, and for the interview, Jason wore a checkered Palestinian keffiyeh around his neck and dark sunglasses. He pretended to be completely ignorant about Iran and eager to find out about just how evil Iran was. "Why is this American dressed like a spy, Mr. Bahari?" asked the new interrogator. "He's pretending to be a spy. It's part of a comedy show," I answered. "Tell the truth," Rosewater shouted. Rosewater is my interrogator whose name I didn't know. I just knew his smell. He smelled of this rosewater perfume, so I called him Rosewater. Rosewater shouted. I couldn't believe it. He honestly seemed to believe what he was saying, that the spy had come to Iran and filmed me for a segment that had appeared on television. From the way he was speaking to me, I drew the conclusion that he was acting tough to impress the other man, who I assumed was his boss. "What is so funny about sitting in a coffee shop with a keffiyeh and sunglasses?" he demanded. "It's just a joke, nothing serious. It's stupid." I was getting worried. "I hope you're not suggesting that he's a real spy." "Can you tell us why an American journalist pretending to be a spy chose to interview you?" asked the other man. "We know that you told them who to interview for their program." I had given Jason and Tim a number of names of people I thought they would be interested in. Others Jason had interviewed, a former vice president and a former foreign minister, had been arrested a week before me as part of the Revolutionary Guard's sweeping crackdown. "It's just comedy, feeling weak." I asked him to listen to the content of the interview. In it, I said that Iran and America had many things in common, like fighting drug trafficking and Al-Qaeda. At the end of the interview, I concluded that George W. Bush's infamous statement about Iraq, North Korea, and Iran being the axis of evil was as idiotic as Iranians going around and burning the American flag. Rosewater pulled a chair over and sat in front of me. "Keep your head down," he said. "Do you think it's also funny that you say Iran and America have a lot in common?" I had to give a careful answer. "Sir, all I'm saying is that Iran needs America for its security as much as America needs Iran for the security of its troops and its interests in the region. We are living in a world where nations cannot live in isolation and prosper. Aren't we all interested in the prosperity of our country?" "Why do you care about U.S. interests?" asked the new man. "Don't you know," added Rosewater, "that Imam Khomeini called America the Great Satan?" They didn't let me answer. The Imam also asked, "Why do we need to have a relationship with America?" Rosewater's boss asked. "America cannot do a damn thing," Rosewater said, repeating one of Ruhollah Khomeini's favorite phrases. It was as if the two of them had been rehearsing this anti-American rant for months. They seemed to be enjoying it. "Do you know why you told that spy about common interests between Iran and America?" asked Rosewater's superior. He seemed to have an answer ready, but I had to defend myself. I thought of my father, who could communicate with anyone. "These men are weak, Maziar," I heard him say. "Appeal to their emotions, gain their sympathy." "Sir," I began. "Many people die in plane crashes in Iran because the Americans do not sell spare parts from old Boeings to Iran, and Iran has to buy worthless, defunct Russian planes. It saddens me to see so many of our compatriots die every year. We are an independent nation. Having relations with America doesn't mean that we must be American slaves. Venezuela, Syria, Russia, and China do not agree with the U.S., yet they maintain diplomatic relations, and sometimes they even cooperate with America. I advocate an equal relationship between Iran and the United States, a relationship based on mutual respect." "And you want us to believe you?" the boss said. "Mutual respect?" Rosewater mocked me. Mr. Bahari, the only reason you are searching for a common ground between Iran and America is that you want to find a way for them to infiltrate our country, the boss concluded. We have kicked them out through the door, and you want to bring them back through the window, Rosewater added, finishing his thought. Bravo, well said, Rosewater's boss declared. Bravo for what, I thought, for being a brainwashed moron? Rosewater finally said, tell America be angry with us and die of that anger. So whatever however hard my 118 days in prison was, and I spent 107 days of it in solitary confinement, I think it was a great education for me. And what I could never understood in many interviews, or even if I spent time with the Revolutionary Guards studying them, I realized the depth of their paranoia, their weakness, and the fact that they were really looking for scapegoats in order to blame their own deficiency, their own failure to create a government that could provide a good health system to the country, good education to people, and blame it on the outside world. And then they had a scenario for me. They had a scenario for a group of us who were working with the different Western organization. I was supposed to be the Western media conduit between the reformists in the government and the Western organizations, and they wanted me to name certain individuals in order to incriminate those individuals, something that I did not do, and I had to endure many days of interrogation and torture because of that. But during even those worst times, I could see that, these are weak people who are really afraid, who are really paranoid, and, their paranoia is real. And in a sense, I think I was talking to Chris this morning that I was just saying that this, when a government is so totalitarian, is so absolutist, any kind of crack within the system, any kind of information, it can be a threat to that system. And I think they rightly realized that I was the enemy. But of course, I'm the enemy of a totalitarian system. If they wanted to reform themselves, not out of the goodness of their heart, but only, to survive as a government, they would be logical enough to work with someone like me who was not a political activist, who did not take guns against the government. But because they are totalitarian, because they're ideological, and because of their paranoia of this narrowing gap between the people, the masses, and the elite of the society, I think they used me and many people like me whose job was just to inform people as scapegoats for their defunct and failed government. And I think it's important to understand that the United States and Iran at the moment, they are in a virtual war. I hope this virtual war is not going to be a real war, but I think the American government, it's very important for the American people, but especially the American government, to remember the name of those three people I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, and remember the ideals that those three people wanted to implant. And they actually, I think they successfully implanted in the subconscious of Iranian people, even though many Iranians may not remember Baskerville, Schuster, or Jordan. The ideas of Baskerville, Schuster, and Morgan are still alive, and those three Americans, they inspire Iranian people even now. And I just hope at the end of my talk that those Americans, they can also inspire the American government, and we find a better solution for the differences between the two countries. So I can answer any questions that you may have. Maybe we can go home now.
You can step up to the mic, please.
I'm not a nuclear expert, so don't ask me about the technicalities of nuclear.
I didn't have a specific question. I was hoping maybe you could just talk for a minute kind of about the Occupy movements going across the world right now, and how they drew their experience and their inspiration from the Arab Spring in general. Maybe you could just talk about that for a minute?
Yeah. Well, I think the Occupy movement is very important, and I sympathize with many ideas of the Occupy movement, and I believe that the Occupy movement has to somehow realize that they are living in a democracy, and has to somehow find a way to pressurize the elected officials in this country or in any other country. Actually, I had a conversation with some people in Wall Street yesterday in New York, and last week in front of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, that it's very important for young people and older people even in the Western democracies to understand that they are living in a democracy, that their elected officials need their votes, and they need to use these elected officials and the fact that their votes count in order to send a message to their leaders. And Occupy movement as a symbol, as a way to express yourself, as a way to vent your anger against the corrupt bankers and greedy financiers is all fine and good, but I think at the end it's very important to pressurize the elected officials. And this is something that Iranian people, unfortunately, do not have a chance to do.
Hello. I've heard now, I kind of got a little different take from you about the 1953 coup of Mossadegh. What I heard, and maybe you could just say a little bit more about how the oil played a role. What I've heard is that Mossadegh was planning to nationalize the oil in Iran, and so I never heard that really it was about the communist, the Russian influence. So that's good to know that. So how much was that a role, the nationalization of oil and our desire to prevent that?
Yeah. Well, what happened was that Mossadegh was elected in 1951 as prime minister by the parliament, and he nationalized the oil a few days later. So the British, they started a campaign against Mossadegh, and also they started to scare the Americans that if Mossadegh if he remains in power, he's going to have a weak government, and as a result, the strong communist party in Iran, which was illegal at the time, but Mossadegh gave them the freedom to act, would come to power, and that would result in a Soviet occupation of Iran. Mossadegh made a couple of mistakes. He did not understand the extent of the fear that the Americans had of the Soviet invasion at the time. And Mossadegh somehow played into the hands of the British, because he would go to Truman, for example. He came to the United States, he met President Truman, and Truman was very sympathetic to the nationalization part of what Mossadegh wanted to do. But on the other hand, the Americans, they somehow try to find a way to make a compromise between Mossadegh and the National Iranian Oil Company. But Mossadegh kept on saying that if you don't support me, it told the Americans that if you don't support me, the communists would come to power. And at the same time, the British, they were using all their resources in order to weaken Mossadegh. So while Mossadegh was being weakened, the Americans' fear was growing. And at the end of 1952, when Eisenhower was elected as president, and at the beginning of 1953, when he came to power and he brought Dulles brothers, he assigned Allen Dulles as the head of the CIA and John Foster Dulles as the Secretary of State. Dulles brothers, they thought that they could not work with Mossadegh because of his anti-British and weak approach to the Soviets. And that's why the CIA, that was primarily why the CIA staged a coup against Mossadegh, because of that. But also CIA, I mean, you have to understand that at the time CIA was a very young organization, composed of very young people. You know, the average age of the people who took part in the 1953 coup was 35. So these were young war veterans who were looking for adventure, who had infinite resources, who had an ambition, and who had the real enemy in front of them, and they were quite motivated, and they did it successfully. And the Iranian coup was the first one. The next one was in Guatemala. The other one was in Congo. On September 11, 1973, they had a coup in Chile. So it was mainly because of that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, I think that eventually this narrowing gap between the elite, the educated people, and the masses, it will result into the demise of the Islamic Republic. I'm very hopeful, very optimistic about the long-term future of Iran, and I think that because people are becoming increasingly educated, they can, young people, they can succeed, and Iran can become a more democratic country. But in the short term, I'm not sure. I'm quite pessimistic because I think the Revolutionary Guards, they will try to widen this gap through sheer brutal force and by imprisoning people, by even killing people. And on the other hand, by developing the nuclear program, for military nuclear program. And unfortunately, it's a volatile, Iran is in a very volatile region, and who knows what kind of action Israel, Saudi Arabia, and any other country that is an enemy of Iran at the moment can take. It's a very, very scary situation, a very volatile situation at the moment, and it's very important for the American public to be educated about the volatility of the region and the consequences of another war. I know that the people don't have appetite for another war in this country, but I think it's very important to remind them of the consequences that a war can have, both on American interests, but also on the people, on the real allies of the United States, who are the young people of Iran. I think that will result in more militarization of the Iranian government. That will basically make the situation so claustrophobic that no voice of dissent can be heard anymore. I mean, if we think that the situation is bad now, I mean, just imagine if there is a foreign enemy. Iranians as a nation who've been attacked and invaded throughout their history several times by different powers. They are very nationalistic, and I think a foreign attack, even a foreign attack, can result in people uniting, even some of the people who don't like the government uniting around the government because of their hatred of the foreign invasion. His question was what the consequences of the Israeli attack. Go ahead. I mean, the poverty level is an interesting phenomenon in Iran, that it's not, for example, Iran is a rich country, whatever, I mean, because of the natural resources, it's a rich country, so you don't have poverty like some African countries or some, even Asian countries. But I think the poverty, the definition of poverty in Iran is in the economic instability. And that is what the government uses in order to remain in power. To create this unstable, government-dependent class of people, of poor people, which it can manipulate. And those people, they mostly live in the outskirts of the cities. They are the people from villages who have migrated to the cities, but they have not been able to assimilate in the cities. So they live in the outskirts of the cities. They're in a very, very volatile economic situation. And they are day workers. Many of them are day workers. Many of them, about 10 million, 1 million family, which is about 7 million people, and some people say even 10 million people, depend on the government's handouts through Imam Khomeini Charity Foundation. So the government can really politically manipulate these people through economic aid or fear-mongering, basically. Sorry, I can't hear you. It's very difficult to hear you. Yeah, there's a mic here, I think, yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Do you think the negative attitude of the U.S. government is so overwhelming that war would be inevitable? And when we go through a next presidential election, are we just waiting to open another war front?
Well, I'm not sure about if it's overwhelming. I know that there is not much of an appetite in both the State Department and Pentagon for another war, period. But I think the most crucial period is between now and the next election. Because if President Obama, who is a wise man, if he thinks that he can be elected only in a war situation, and if he's the war president, that can be quite dangerous. And also, I think some conservatives and some neocons who are still in power or still in Washington, they can have any influence. That can be really, really dangerous. That they can just, they see their survival, their counterparts basically with the Revolutionary Guard, they see their survival in a war with Iran. And I think they should really, really give the sanctions a chance to work. And I think that is what the Obama administration wants to do at the moment now, which it can have actually negative consequences on Iranian people. But I think for the moment, I think the Obama administration will go for tougher sanctions. Actually, they announced tougher sanctions today. They didn't specify what tougher sanctions, but most probably they will want to go after the Central Bank of Iran and the export of crude oil.
The sanctions that the West has put on Iran, is this actually strengthening the regime, making them more self-sufficient? This is a concern that I have, is that the sanctions we put on them are actually making them more self-sufficient and therefore, self-reliant, ultimately more powerful. Do you have any?
Yeah, well, I think the sanctions that are in place, they are not really well defined and well designed. I think some sanctions are quite helpful. The sanctions against the nuclear program, against the export of military equipment to Iran, I think those are very important, and the sanctions of banks that are involved in such activities are important. I don't think that it will make Iran really more self-sufficient. In certain areas, yes, it can have that effect, but the sanctions are not really targeting those areas. I mean, banking sanctions, yes, that can affect those areas, but in terms of, for example, the nuclear equipment, in terms of the military equipment, Iranians cannot be, no country can be self-sufficient. Even superpowers like China, Russia, the United States, they are not self-sufficient. The United States needs technology from France and United Kingdom, and so I don't think that. But I always, whenever I meet American officials, I always advocate positive exceptions to the sanctions, because the banking sanctions are so comprehensive that anyone who has any kind of transactions with Iran can be penalized. An Iranian American whose a family member is getting married in Iran and wants to send money to Iran can be penalized because of that. And I think that the American government, the Treasury, the State Department, they have to add to their staff for exceptions, and they have to win the hearts and minds of the Iranians before the military attack, not after not like the disaster in Iraq that bombed the country and then they start winning. They want to start winning their hearts and minds. Yeah.
I wondered if you care to make some comments about the uprisings in the Middle East, why they happened at this time, and also you made comment about the 3 Americans that had an effect that were respected in Iran, and I wonder if the uprising, if there's any connection that you see with American involvement over the years in Persian Gulf, Iraq or Afghanistan, if there's connections there.
Yeah. Well, I think that what we call the Arab Spring is really a fight for human dignity, that people want to be regarded as dignified citizens of their country. I mean, people in this country, they have the rights as citizens of the country. Sometimes when these rights are denied from people, people can protest against it. For example, this Occupy Wall Street, Occupy movements around the country, around the United States, that's a manifestation of that. So I think in the Arab world, in other countries, we will see the same, we have seen it, and we will see the same situation, that people want an accountable government. Much of what is going on in the Arab world, I mean, I traveled to Tunisia and Egypt a few months ago, and much of what is happening in those countries doesn't have to do anything with America. I mean, during all the demonstrations, even during the demonstration by the radical Islamists,